Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Today, we're taking a look at 10 things that Dungeon Masters forget all the time when running combat.
Monty and I have forgotten everything on this list multiple times and still do today, because no matter how much you memorize the rules, there's a lot to keep track of, and you're probably always going to forget something.
There's a lot that Dungeon Masters have to manage in combat, and it's not just the rules, because, as Kelly and I like to say, the story doesn't stop just because the swords are drawn. And so when you're managing combat, not only is it really easy to forget a whole bunch of things involving the rules and the mechanics, player character and monster powers and what they do, but it's also really easy to forget the role-playing at the same time.
So today we're going to look at 10 things that DMs forget in combat. 5 of these options are going to be mechanical, and 5 of them have to do with role-playing. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling. Kicking things off with one that both Monty and I have forgotten, but luckily this is one that everybody at the table is going to remind you forgot, and that is forgetting someone's turn.
It is always the worst to do this, and it doesn't matter how well you track initiative, like what accessories you use, it still happens.
I will have literally the list of player names in front of me in the order that they're supposed to go in, and I'll still somehow forget somebody. Again, luckily, if you miss a player's turn, they're going to say, hey, you missed my turn, because everybody else is keeping track of that initiative as well. The bigger problem is that occasionally I forget monster turns, especially if I have, let's say, 5 or 6 minions.
Yeah.
And I'll forget which ones I already acted with and which ones I didn't, because exciting things can be happening with each one. Some of them have different moves and abilities, and so I'll finish, move on, and be like, oh, there's those 2 guys over there. I didn't even, oh, well, forget it. And that can actually really impact the difficulty level of your combat encounter.
There are a variety of ways that you can track initiative, from writing it out on paper in a list, or from getting an initiative tower, or for using cards that you drape over your Dungeon Master's screen, or of course, if you're playing on a virtual tabletop, will often be tools that track these. I do find that the virtual tabletops are generally a little bit better at reminding you that it's someone's turn, because there are the automation functions that are built into those. Regardless of how good those tools are, I have forgotten using all of them. And it's okay when it happens. If it's a player's turn that you skipped, immediately have their turn happen next. If it's a monster's turn that you skipped, I would wait until an appropriate moment to bring them back into the order. It's not as important when the monsters forget their turn as opposed to the players.
In my opinion, if your monsters are minions and you forgot 2 out of your 7 minions, you can probably just say, oops, I'll get them next time. If you did forget a major player in the combat, like if you have 3 monsters and they're all big, beefy monsters and you missed one of their turns, you might want to say, hey, I forgot this guy's turn. Can I pop it back? Or I'm going to pop it back in after you finish going.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to resolve it, if you did forget a monster's turn entirely, and what usually happens for me is that I realize the next round that monster didn't do anything last turn. I think the easiest thing to do to kind of make up for it is to give the monster like advantage on its attacks. I don't know if I would necessarily give it a double turn, because sometimes the impact of that can swing the opposite way around. Use your judgment in these cases. In a lot of cases, I've just said, you know what, I forgot it, whatever. It's not a huge problem in this specific case. It does vary, but generally, whether it's making up for it with a bonus action or an extra turn or advantage, or just deciding, you know what, it's fine, I forgot, whatever.
Also, when you're running combat, there are a lot of effects to track. There's a lot to track in general in D&D, which is why you'll hear Monty and I forget these. If you ever watch our actual play, we forget these a lot. Monty forgets them a lot. I forget them at my table. You're going to forget these from time to time. And if you remember one, chances are you'll forget one of the other ones.
Yeah, these include Forgetting to ask a player to make a concentration check when they take damage while concentrating on a spell. Forgetting that an ongoing spell effect or other status condition is in play. Forgetting damage that has been applied to a monster's hit points or some other condition, effect, or active thing. It might be the environment, it might be a wild magic thing, it might be exhaustion. All of these things can get forgotten in the moment. And while there's a lot of tools to help you remember, such as little tokens that you can place beside somebody. I've seen some players have a little flag when they're concentrating on something. It still happens even when you use the tools.
I also think it's important not to hold your players responsible for forgetting that they have a status effect on them. It's both the DM and the player's responsibility to remember these things. And oftentimes both have forgotten. There have been multiple times where you have stunned me or grappled me or something like that. And then the next turn I move and act freely because I forgot and you don't stop me because you forgot. And everybody at the table just forgot that the monster did something crazy to me. And we all act normally. And, you know, we hear in the comments all the time, people will be like, wasn't Kelly grappled? And oops, it happens.
Yeah, and even in a relatively simple combat encounter, the players are fighting one monster. If you have 4 players, all of those players have some sort of spell or status effect or some sort of ability that they can put into play, and the monster does as well. That's 5 things to keep track of, and no one person is going to be able to necessarily keep track of them all, but as a DM, you do actually have to hold those all in your brain. Visual references help a lot. But if it turns out, again, you get around to a turn and you're like, oh, wait, do what you can to correct it. But if you can't, you don't need to rewind the combat at all. Like if I've forgotten a concentration check, sometimes I'll just be like, well, we're just going to roll it now. And even though the spell would not have been in play before, and that would have affected all these things, we're not going to rewind the combat. I think that that's a thing that is more disruptive than the fact that you forgot.
I think another thing is that when you are designing combat encounters, keep in mind what abilities your monsters can inflict. What spells do they have access to? What conditions can they inflict on the players? Try to keep it simple. If you have 3 or 4 wizards, maybe you have one that can incapacitate the whole party, and if they succeed in that, then the other ones are going to pummel them with damage-dealing spells. You might want to pile on maybe 2 conditions if you're really mean and you want to incapacitate them and drop Sickening Radiance on them. But if you have one wizard who ends up incapacitating them, another one puts Sickening Radiance, another one Evard's Black Tentacles, another one, whatever, it starts to add up, and you're then taking each turn being like, remember to take the damage from this spell and then roll for this ability, but then don't forget to roll your save. And it becomes a lot, and it can bog down play, but also it's so much easier to forget if you have all of these things going on. Try to keep it simple and have multiple effects that are either the same type of effect affecting different people, or have one effect and then just hit them for damage.
This is definitely one of those things that you can set yourself up for, not failure, but set yourself up for a hard time when you're designing those combat encounters. As Kelly said, when you're designing your encounter, often the impulse can be you want to make things as interesting and unique as possible. Adding in all those monsters that have these cool ongoing effects that create those cool concentration spells. However, it's worth deciding how much mental load you want to take on, because at the end of the day, I find that damage pressure, like just monsters that can do a lot of damage, often create just as much drama and suspense and excitement and challenge as the overlapping status effects and conditions and things like that that are often a lot to manage. And if you then forget those effects, then it doesn't end up being a very challenging encounter.
A lot of the coolest monsters in the game have a lot of unique abilities and features that they can use. This includes legendary actions, lair actions, and a lot of monsters will have bonus actions or reactions as well. Sometimes you're going to forget to use any or all of these.
It can be as simple as forgetting to make that attack of opportunity when a player character moves out of reach, or forgetting that the player can do it to the monster. I often forget legendary actions, especially those ones that cost like 2 actions or 3 actions. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've had a monster that I used their 2-action legendary action and then forgot to spend that last legendary action, or forgot to take the bonus action teleportation, or just completely forgot the lair action.
And it can actually work in the other way as well, where you take the legendary action that costs 2 actions, and then you forgot that it costs 2 actions, so you then take 2 more legendary actions. Either way, you're either creating a detriment in your combat encounter or a benefit, which is a detriment for the players. And forgetting to use these features, or forgetting that you already took your reaction and then using your reaction again. This also applies to players, a lot of the bonus action and reactions. Remember when you use them. Remember when I'm saying this and you might be like, Kelly, you hypocrite. You forget that you used your reaction all the time. I see you trying to use 2. I know. I'm a very forgetful person. And again, no matter how much I can memorize the rules, in the moment, there's only so much that my brain can think of in the spot, and I find myself embarrassingly forgetting everything all the time.
Yeah, forgetting that you've already taken a reaction this turn, or forgetting that you've already taken your bonus action, or the worst one, of course, is the bonus action spell casting rule of where you misty stepped and then you cast a spell. And it's even worse because some monsters will have bonus actions that aren't spells. So there will be monsters that can do things like teleport and cast a spell because they've got a mixed use of abilities. Again, this is where deciding on what monsters that you want to put into your combat encounter, what monsters you want to put up against the players, maybe you choose the level of simplicity that works for you. I find that it is really hard to manage multiple monsters that have legendary actions. So I don't ever use more than 1 monster with legendary actions, and I try to really limit how many monsters I put with them in the combat encounter when I do. I really try to avoid having monsters that have multiple different types of reactions. I remember one combat encounter I made that was a rival adventuring party where all of the rival adventurers had a different reaction ability. In theory, that was a cool combat, except I forgot all of those reaction powers.
I also think when it comes to lair actions, the simplest rule of thumb is to give lair actions their own tag on your initiative tracker and put them up at initiative count 20. And let them happen there. But again, you might forget them anyway. But lair actions can be a really interesting part of a combat encounter with a legendary monster. So try not to forget them, and remember to read them as well. If you're looking at a monster that has legendary actions, read the lore section to make sure you're not missing that cool chunk of lair actions that might be there. Some of the dragon lair actions are some of my favorite aspects of doing a dragon battle. So do your best not to forget, but if you do, don't hold yourself too accountable for forgetting stuff. We do it all the time.
Another big part of this that monsters have is monsters that have recharge powers. Yeah, I forget a lot to roll the recharge, and oftentimes I'll get to a monster's turn and be like, okay, they're going to do this turn, and then I remember to roll the recharge, and the power recharges, and now I'm like, should they use the recharge, should they not? So again, in terms of like just general principles, I try to avoid using multiple monsters that have multiple recharge powers. You got 1 monster with 1 recharge power, all good, but like, I run in combat encounters where I have 4 dragons, and I love doing the multiple dragon fight. But whenever I've done that, it's always a pain to remember to roll the recharge and be like, okay, did this dragon recharge their breath weapon? This one didn't. And it's so hard, even if you do have like the tokens to track it and you have the checklist and you have the virtual tabletop. I forget to put the token down. I forget to do the check mark. So it's one thing to have the tool, and then it's another thing to remember to use the tool. And so sometimes the the act of adding the tool adds the extra bandwidth that you have to track. And so you know yourself, you know your capabilities as a dungeon master. Is it about having the tool to help you remember these things? Or is it better for you to just reduce the amount of elements that you have in play at once? I can't answer that question for you. That's something that every dungeon master has to decide for themselves. I find for myself, it's better for me to have less happening and less to track in general, instead of trying to have a better tool to track multiple things at the same time.
Speaking of all of those cool monster abilities, monsters tend to have a lot of other features on their stat blocks that can be easily forgotten. I myself am notorious for forgetting the monster's cool features, abilities, resistances, and traits, whether they have magic resistance, elemental resistance, condition immunities. All of these are so easily forgotten, and it doesn't matter how much prep I do. I will sit there before I run the game and reread the stat blocks and say, Kelly, remember that this monster takes half damage from any attack that isn't by a magical weapon. And then we get into the combat encounter, and I make it take full damage from all the attacks, and I'm wondering why it died so quickly. And it happens so often that I will finish a combat encounter, say, wow, they really swept the floor with those monsters. Look back at the stat block, and suddenly like 5 things pop out to me so obviously that I'm like, in the moment, how did I not see those?
The worst one for me is when the player does a really cool ability. Like, they're like, all right, I'm going to cast Dominate Monster on this enemy. And we roll the saving throw, they fail, someone else uses silvery barbs or something like that. There's a counterspell battle, and then all these things happen, and then I go, oh wait, this monster's immune to charm. I can't tell you how many times that has happened to me. And it's a bit of a downer moment too, especially if the players have done like all the different resources and you remembered a bunch of other things, and then forgot the fact that the ability just doesn't work at all. Or sometimes you'll remember that the monster has been affected by it at the start of its turn, and now the players already like took advantage of the fact that they had advantage on attack rolls against it or did damage to it or something like that, and then you're thinking, oh wait, it should have been not incapacitated, so it shouldn't have taken that crit. And again, don't roll back the encounter, just be like, I forgot this, from here on out this is how it's going to work.
The other one that I forget a lot is oftentimes monsters will have an attack that says the standard thing, it does X amount of damage when it hits, but then it will usually have additional text. If it has a cool attack that says, you know, they have to make a Constitution saving throw, they take 22 additional poison damage. And you read that, and then you start making the attack. And then you hit the character, and then you have a back and forth, and suddenly you move on and forget that that extra part of it ever existed. And there can be a lot of cool effects that happen with the monster's attacks. And for me, when I'm forgetting both the resistances and the additional damage it could be doing, I'm really throwing that monster under the bus and like nullifying that combat encounter by presenting something that should have been an adequate challenge to my party, but it's not doing the damage it should, and it's taking more damage than it should. That's going to totally change your combat encounter.
This happens a lot with monsters that are sort of paladins or rogues, where they have the smite or a barbarian rage or the sneak attack. And this is where I find I really gravitate towards the stat blocks that have it built in, and I use description to bring that out. For example, a whole bunch of the angel stat blocks, the angels just do 4d6 extra radiant damage on every attack that they deal. They don't have to actively say they're smiting, but you can still describe that like they are smiting the player character. Another good example of this, invisible stalkers and certain types of wraiths and incorporeal undead that do extra damage when they have advantage, and they're written in the way that the attack says this attack does extra damage if the monster had advantage, as opposed to an assassin stat block where it's got, here's the short sword attack, and then up in its monster traits is the sneak attack. Sometimes what I'll do is if I have a monster that in its traits it does extra damage, but that hasn't been baked into the stat block, I'll just reorganize the stat block for myself and say, put that extra damage, just put that in the attack so that my eyes are focused on it. And that just helps to remember that that trait is there. It might even be for yourself, depending on your DMing style, it might behoove you to print out the monster stat block or use a monster stat card and bust out your highlighter and or a red marker or something and just circle those things so that you have it on hand and remember it and even mark it off and check it off. Again, it's okay if you forget. You don't have to retcon things. Don't go back to the beginning. Like if you forgot all the combat, sometimes though you can fix it. Like if you did forget and you realize when the monster's down to 10 hit points that the whole time it had resistance, you can correct that.
You never are really announcing to your players what the monster's hit points are. So it's not really cheating if you're like, oh man, I've been forgetting resistance this whole time, and you bump it from 10 back up to like 75. And you're like, okay.
Yeah, that's an okay fudge, I would say, if you realize too late.
Especially if it's like the second round of combat and you're like, why are they killing this thing so fast?
Yeah.
Now, the monster stat blocks have a lot going on, but so do the players. And yes, it is up to the players to remember what their characters can do, but you might have some moments where you forget the exact interaction of certain abilities, how they interact with the monster abilities, and you might want to bust out the rule book to start flipping through it and just making sure that you understand everything going on at your table. But oftentimes, if you're busting out the rule book, you're stopping combat for an extended rules debate. The player thinks that something works one way, you think it works another. You start going back and forth, and you've derailed the whole combat encounter. I think that it's important to remember that the DM has the final say, and to make an adequate ruling. The idea of making a ruling and moving on, and even admitting if you and the player are at odds about how certain ability works, you might say, I'm going to rule it this way for now. After the combat encounter, why don't we look it up and decide if that's right or talk about it later. I think that that's perfectly fine.
However, sometimes it makes a big impact. One of the rules that we forget all the time is Sebastian is a shadow sorcerer, and when he's reduced to 0 hit points, he has that strength of the grave power that you can make the charisma save to stay standing. We forget this all the time, and that's a rule that can be a life or death situation. And so there is a shared two-way street. The player does have to remember those life or death saving abilities. It's really worth maybe even pinning a note in your GM screen to say, don't forget the players have this power or this ability or this trump card of some kind, and this is how it works. I've sometimes forgotten that I give my players a magic item that just totally upends.
Like Wilhelm and his poison resistance amulet, and then you did a whole dungeon of poison and forgot that you had given me that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many things where you'll or you'll forget that it turns out the players have the ability to teleport or breathe underwater or walk through walls or do something that completely bypasses an element of the encounter, and you're just like, oh, all this planning down the drain. But again, you got to roll with the punches. It's not worth grinding the adrenaline and the action of a combat encounter to a halt to go on an extended rules debate. If you are starting to Google sage advice, you have gone too far.
Save it for after.
Yeah.
Now that we've covered a lot of the mechanics that you're probably forgetting in your combat encounters, keep in mind that the narrative doesn't stop just because the dice are rolled, and that means that role-playing also has a major impact on our combat encounter. And we can forget some of the nuance of how the role-playing, the story, and the narrative can impact our combat encounter. The first one being forgetting the point of the combat encounter in itself. Usually, and hopefully, if you're designing a combat encounter, there's a reason why that combat encounter exists. It's the group of soldiers trying to stop them from entering the castle. It's the group of goblins attacking them because they're in the village that they're raiding. And why are they raiding the village? Why are they not allowed in the castle? You want to know these things, and forgetting why you're even having a combat encounter is not good. You want to have that at the forefront of your combat encounter because the narrative is what's making your combat encounter interesting.
There's nothing wrong with having a fight just to have a fight, but that can eventually get boring and repetitive. A combat encounter that doesn't have meaningful stakes behind it often can feel hollow and empty and result in the players just using their abilities to get through the battle and not really care about what happens. It also, a battle that doesn't have much of a point to it also limits the ways that the players might be able to engage with it creatively in different ways as well. And so having a reason for the combat and having a purpose or an objective behind the combat encounter then that is asking something more than just will the players survive or will the players kill the enemies will make your combat encounters more meaningful and more memorable. And even when you have planned that, it's really important to follow it through and not just boil down what could be a dramatic encounter with lots of interesting story happening into just a slugfest of who's hitting who.
Keeping the narrative at the forefront also is going to help you role-play out the combat encounter and how it moves forward. If the players are not allowed in the castle and they get caught in the castle, a combat encounter might happen. But the combat encounter could just end with the guards tossing them out of the castle and closing the door and not trying to kill them, but incapacitating them, maybe locking them in prison. Or maybe the player characters are not doing too well in the combat and they flee out of the castle. The guards aren't going to chase them through all the streets of the city until they fight to the death. They might just lock up the castle and double their manpower on the guard stations. There's a lot of ways that keeping the narrative in focus might help imply how your monsters or NPCs respond to the way the battle unfolds.
And on that respect, one of the other things that dungeon masters often forget to do is forget to set the scene up so that that point can be reinforced. Describe the environment that the combat encounter is happening in. What part of the castle is it in? What locations are adjacent to it? Are they close to the entrance? Are they nearby the dungeons? Where are we in the world? As you go through that, also describe the enemies, their equipment, and what happens when they make attacks. I find that it's really helpful to go through my monsters, and sometimes I'll hold up the miniature and say, so this scary looking guy has scything arms that are dripping with acid and an eyeball that resonates with a hypnotic pattern. And these can give the player characters clues as to what the monsters might do. And furthermore, by describing the monsters and pointing at their miniatures or their tokens or whatever you might be using to track them, you also have an opportunity to remind yourself what they do and give the players that hint as to what might be coming along the way. It makes the whole thing more immersive and makes them feel like understand what they're fighting.
I've known times that Monty has described a creature with hypnotic eyes, and I immediately am terrified to look at that monster or have it look at me. Those sort of details can actually add to the atmosphere of the combat encounter and really instill a sense of fear in your players.
Yeah, it's so much more than just plonking down and saying, you know, there's certain monsters that you immediately strike fear into the hearts of your players by saying, this is an intellect devourer. And the name of the monster just evokes enough fear, but especially if it's a creature that the players have never encountered before. Like, what is this thing? A Tuscarora Kiori.
Great.
Right? It's a cool monster from Eberron. It's a really sweet thing, but like it is worth saying what you see and what you encounter and describing how it moves and how it attacks and what is around the player characters, what they might be able to interact with. Even if you are playing with full terrain and miniatures or playing on a detailed virtual tabletop with beautiful maps and you've got amazing tokens and artwork, it is helpful to go through what is on the board and say, this is here, this is what it looks like, this is how it moves, this is how it acts. This dude is wearing plate armor. This guy is carrying a shield. She over here, she's got a crossbow. It looks like she's got a bunch of vials that are glowing with green liquid. It adds so much, and yes, it adds a lot at the beginning of the combat encounter, but it's worth it.
When I worked retail, one of the things that we were told is that the easiest way to stop a customer from being disappointed is to set the right expectations.
Yeah.
And same goes with this. If you set the right expectations, you can instill fear rather than disappointment. If you just plunk a monster down and then I roll to hit and I get a 20 and you say I missed, I might be like, are you kidding me? But if you plunk a miniature down and say, this guy walks up to you, he has full plate armor, you can't even see his face behind his massive helmet, he has a tower shield and a giant sword, then when I roll 20 to hit and don't hit, I go, oh no.
Yeah.
I saw this coming and I'm unhappy about it, but I'm not disappointed or thrown off. And then when that guy takes his big, huge sword and hits me and does 20 damage back to me, I go, man, I knew this guy looked tough, but now I know he's tough.
Although I will admit that there are some miniatures where when you plonk that miniature down, you will get the reaction. Like when you put down the Orcus mini or the Tarask mini or the Ancient Red Dragon mini or the Elderbrain mini, like
Yeah.
you do, it does do it. When you do plonk it down, like that's the reason to milk the moment. Right?
You still want to give a description to that monster.
Yeah.
If I plonk the giant Tiamat mini down on the table, I'm still going to do like a 5-minute description of how scary Tiamat is. But also, when I plonk that mini down, my players are going to cry, and that's what we want.
You might do a beautiful job of setting the scene. You might describe the monsters. You might describe the set that scene. You might be remembering what the point is. And then all of a sudden, your players decide, yeah, we're casting Dimension Door, and we're just getting out. Or all of a sudden, the players decide, oh, you know what? We surrender. Or maybe the bard pulls out the lute and starts singing a song and challenges the lich to a dance-off.
These are okay.
Yeah!
These are great. And one of the early mistakes that I made as a DM was that I really was determined that if I planned a combat encounter, we need to have a combat encounter. But on the side of not even being determined, but sometimes you're just too wrapped up in your planning that you forget to allow creative alternatives. It's not that you're saying no to the players. It's that they start plotting creative alternatives, but you've already planned the combat encounter, and so you have the monster notice that they're casting Dimension Door and suddenly counterspell them, even though the players were very far away and the monsters shouldn't have noticed them by now. Maybe you have them draw swords and start attacking the bard, even though it would have been really cool if he was allowed to have the dance-off. So don't forget to allow for creative alternatives. You're planning combat encounters because they might happen. You're planning the narrative, you're planning the point of those combat encounters, but don't be beholden to the fact that they have to happen. Be open to the creative solutions of your players, and don't forget to allow them that room to be creative.
And, of course, that creative alternative might bypass the entire combat entirely, or it might completely upend the outcome of the battle and totally circumnavigate or cancel out or negate whatever monster's abilities or traits that they might have. Part of the reason why I love Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in particular is because it is not so mechanically weighted around combat that it allows for that openness. When I played previous editions of D&D, particularly 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which was really geared towards balanced combat experiences, it really closed off a lot of that possibility because there was so much mechanical focus on the player characters engaging with that video game-like experience of combat, which was excellent. I loved it, and it's good. But because the weight of the rules and the weight of the encounter building system and the weight of the balance of the game says the combat encounter must proceed like this. It will go for 3 rounds, and this is how much damage, and this is the resources. I love 5th edition in particular for its ability to just upend things entirely. And so, yes, is that unbalanced? Totally. Sometimes the player characters do it. Sometimes it's a broken ability that does it. Sometimes it's a creative solution. And within all that, there is a wonderful, chunky sort of balance that I like and allow for that.
Another thing that you might forget during your combat encounter is that you don't need to grind it out to the last hit point. The morale of your monsters matters. And a lot of times you're too busy keeping track of all of the cool abilities, all of the turn orders. You want them to get their punches in so that it feels like an interesting combat. You're keeping the point and the narrative in focus. And so you draw it out for 5 rounds when the players have already won because they have killed all but 2 of the monsters.
Stop, he's already dead.
Yeah.
Sometimes the monsters, especially if they're intelligent, and especially if they're not monsters, they're people, don't want to throw their lives away. Generally speaking, I try to run most of my humanoid opponents as they do not want to die. And straight up, in most cases, the protagonist in a fantasy story engaging with them is a death sentence. And so, in many cases, it is worthwhile to consider when they might run. In a lot of cases, especially depending on how realistically you want to go, the moment the first enemy is killed or goes down, that actually is a really good moment for some people to ask, maybe I don't want that to happen to me too, and I'm going to get out of here. It's always going to vary, of course. Undead monsters might not feel this way. Constructs might not feel this way. So, and on the other way of it, if a hungry predator downs one of the player characters, they might not stay and fight. They might just be interested in taking their meal and running. So it cuts both ways. But all of that to say, you don't have to drag it out.
Oftentimes you can get a sense of the table when a combat encounter is dragging on too long. And those telltale signs of your players are just doing the same thing. Okay, well, we just have 8 more skeletons to kill. We already killed the Lich Lord.
Yeah.
This is kind of the point in the battle. Once the main enemy is dead, especially in a combat encounter where you have like the main villain and its minions. If the main villain goes down and there's only a few minions left, they probably run away.
Or surrender, or what have you. Any of those options are good. And maybe sometimes on the inverse case, one of my favorite ways to immediately up the drama of an encounter and end it on a different note is if I have intelligent foes that down one of the player characters, I've done a thing where I have one of the enemies ready in action to finish the player character off and say, we've got one of you down now. We're going to finish it unless you give up. And that's a really dramatic way to A, up the tension, and B, ask the players, are you willing to risk it? And sometimes it's paid off. Oftentimes the players do like that kind of standoff kind of moment. And sometimes it works out for them and sometimes it doesn't.
And along with your combat encounter, we've talked about making sure to describe the environment, but don't forget to use the environment. A lot of times when you're planning a combat encounter, you always have your combat encounter set in an interesting location, or at least you should. It's not just an empty room in the dungeon. What type of room is it? What's in this room? Oh, there's a furnace in the room? Can one of the enemies grab a shovel of hot coals and throw it at a player? Can the players do the same to the enemies? There's always cool environmental things that can be done. And some of my favorite moments in my campaigns are when the environment is interacted with. So not only should you remember to describe the environment, but remember to use the environment. If the players aren't using it, you using it will help show the players that it's okay to use it. One of my favorite moments in one of my home games was I just described a tavern with a fireplace and there were some bandits in the tavern. One of my players walked into the tavern and walked over to the fire and started poking it with his sword. He didn't tell me why in the moment. He just said, I walk over and start poking it with my sword. And then as the bandits and the rest of the players started to get rowdy with each other, he turned and said some cool one-liner and pulled out his now burning sword and then started attacking them. And I just went with it and gave him extra fire damage for that combat encounter.
I love those moments. I've run combat encounters where the player characters were in the sewers. And do you remember the one where it was contaminated water and one of the monsters had control water and flooded the room? Or I've also done combat encounters where I actually remember one combat that I loved where there was an enemy cleric, and this was back in 3rd edition, but the enemy cleric had a bunch of sacrificial victims, and there was a spell that allowed them to draw power from their prisoners and use like their blood to power their spells. It made for a cool like, oh no moment, or that moment where all of a sudden it turns out that the something in the environment comes to life, like an earth elemental rises out of the floor, or the fire that is burning turns out to be a fire elemental in some way, shape, or form, or of course, mimics.
You can't forget the environment if the environment is the monster.
Yes, exactly. And so, the mimic ship. That was a fantastic one where we ran a dungeon on the idea that a ship that was parked in the harbor turned out to be one giant mimic. So the dungeon itself was a huge monster, and it was super cool because it meant that the dynamic completely shifted. But again, as Kelly described, you don't have to go to the super fantastic. It can be something as simple as, you know what? Instead of describing this bandit as using a club, I'm going to describe how he picks up a chair and it's like, the bandit with the wooden chair comes in from the kitchen. And just that alone, it's just a basic attack, right?
You use the club attack.
Yeah. But the idea of someone coming out of the kitchen and hitting the player with a chair, or the cook comes out with the meat cleaver or a chicken drumstick, and it's using the same stats.
2 fish.
Yeah. Doesn't need to be anything more complicated than that, but that is hilarious. It's funny. It's memorable. It makes things feel more dynamic, even though nothing more complicated is happening in the rules.
The main point of all of these is that it's okay to forget. You have a lot to keep track of as a dungeon master in your game. There's a lot going on, a lot of narrative elements, a lot of mechanical elements, and you're going to forget things. Monty and I, again, do it all the time, but that doesn't diminish the fun at our table. A lot of times we just laugh it off and say, oops, forgot that ability, or oops, forgot that rule. And yeah, maybe my players steamrolled a combat encounter because I forgot that it had resistances or did extra damage. Maybe I forgot the environment completely, or maybe I forgot to let my characters run away, and that NPC probably could have survived for a later combat encounter, but he didn't, and now he's dead. All of that's fine. It's fine to forget.
I just think that in the balance of things, if you forget the rules, it's probably, again, there's the corner cases where it's life or death. But outside of the rules, it's not going to really make the game less fun. But when you forget the narrative elements, you're losing out on an opportunity to make the game more fun. So, if anything, I feel, everyone has their strengths and weaknesses as a dungeon master. And I do feel that overall, for me, if it's the choice between forgetting a couple of the rules once in a while, but I remember the cool narrative stuff, I think that pays a bigger dividend in the end on the fun and the enjoyment of the table. But find the pace that works for yourself and for your own group. And remember that, yes, sometimes remembering the rules is important, and sometimes the rules generate fun. That's what they're there for. The rules are there to help you have fun, not prevent you from having fun. So there is a balance to all of these things.
Tell us about the biggest rules that you've forgotten at your table in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on the channel, please consider becoming a supporter of the show by following the links down below.
And if you want to see us having a great time forgetting all of these, you can check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes of the current season right up over here.
And we've got plenty more tips to help you manage combat and all the things that come with DMing right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.